So at a time in our history when we find ourselves in the clutches of a presidency defined by utter arrogance and unfettered egoism, at such a time like this, it might be somewhat consoling to recall that the man who is often ranked as one of this country's 2 or 3 greatest presidents, that man was a quintessential man of sorrows, as we put it. At the age of 9, Abraham Lincoln lost both his mother and a beloved aunt and uncle to a mysterious disease. His father survived that particular plague, but was so aloof, was so cool toward his son, that observers doubted that there could be any love between father and son. And then Lincoln's sister died in childbirth, followed in short order by the death of the woman who had been the object of the young lawyer's first romantic interest. In his late 20s, the political career of this gangly, awkward Lincoln was faltering. His career was faltering, and another woman that he had seriously courted married his best friend instead. Lincoln's eventual wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, had an unstable personality, and eventually she was committed to an asylum. In their second year in the White House, Abraham and Mary lost their 11-year-old son to typhoid fever, probably contracted from the District of Columbia's tainted water supply. Lincoln was so grief-stricken over this loss that members of his staff worried that he would now be unable to carry out his duties as president. And yet, despite this long history of setbacks and tragedies and disappointments, and despite a lifetime of chronic and sometimes severe depression, Abraham Lincoln became a figure of mythic proportions. And so the question is, how did he do it? In that pre-therapeutic age, how did someone so deeply wounded manage his pain, call forth the emotional reserves to think clearly, act decisively, and inspire confidence during perhaps the worst chapter in our nation's history? And so what sort of insights can we glean from Lincoln's struggle against adversity, insights that may prove useful to some of us who feel despairing today? Most notably, Abraham Lincoln developed a mindfulness practice, not necessarily of the kind taught by contemporary meditation instructors, but a practice that did allow Lincoln to confront and to work through his inner conflicts. Lincoln's practice, like Mary Oliver, it was to write poetry, but mostly very dark, gloomy poetry. This is an example of Lincoln's poetry. I hear the loved survivors tell how naught from death could save, till every sound appears a knell and every spot a grave. I range the fields with pensive tread and pace the hollow rooms and feel, companion of the dead, that I'm living in the tombs. Lincoln was hardly original or exceptional in this respect. He was a product of the 19th century Romantic Rebellion, and he both read and wrote poetry in order to manage the grief, the melancholy, and the fear that afflicted him. Emily Dickinson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, William Cullen Bryant, all employed poetry for very much the same purpose. Poetry. Composing a poem requires one to maintain sustained attention on the feelings that the subject matter evokes in us. You do not dash off a poem the way that you write an email, and that, the deliberative process involved in writing poetry, gives the writer the opportunity to focus on their emotions long enough to begin to identify with the source of that emotion, assign it meaning, and to put it in proper perspective. In her book, Emotional Alchemy, Tara Bennett Goldman contrasts mindfulness with the quality of awareness that we typically bring to our daily affairs. Unless, she says, unless we make a concerted effort to concentrate our attention it will be fragmented by a constant stream of distractions. And we learn somehow to use all of those distractions to avoid working on painful and disturbing emotions that we want to shut out or push to the side. We tear our attention away from those emotions, Goleman says, and thus we cut off the feelings prematurely. But when we fail to stay with our feelings long enough to allow them to run their course, we deprive ourselves of the opportunity to learn something from them. Mindfulness hides from nothing, Goleman says. It cuts through all of our mechanisms of denial, delivers to us an honest picture of an inner reality. And the good news is that confidence and patience grow from this bold and challenging awareness. Confidence and patience grow from this bold awareness, and that certainly was the case with Abraham Lincoln. Now, this process of attending to our emotions mindfully can also be undercut by well-meaning friends and relatives who encourage us not to dwell on painful or negative sentiments. Much of the advice people who are wounded, hurting, or unhappy receive, much of the advice they receive is couched in the language of rationalization and denial. We are told to look on the bright side of things. We are told, well, things could be worse. Try to find the silver lining. We all get over it, don't we? There's always a light at the end of the tunnel. All kinds of remarks like that. But such positive aphorisms may be helpful at some point on the healing path, but not while the presenting emotions are still so raw and so powerful. The noted grief counselor Alan Wolfelt recommends what he calls a homeopathic approach to our emotional life, to go with that which is presented to us rather than to buck up against it. He says, instead of trying to manage the grief, you realize the value of letting the grief manage the person. And instead of trying to quickly get away from our feelings, we try to savor them. And instead of trying to outmaneuver those forces and use some kind of premature technique to return our life to normal as quickly as possible, we turn instead in the direction of the symptoms. The sufferer, Wolfelt says, must descend before she can transcend. Now, Abraham Lincoln also developed a perspective on life that perhaps allowed him better to cope with misfortune, with loss, than most of us perhaps do today. That was his second advantage. Joshua Wolf-Schenck describes Abraham Lincoln's outlook as depressive realism. Depressive realism. He never believed, Lincoln didn't, that life had somehow dealt him a bad hand, that life had mistreated him, or that somehow he deserved a better hand than he had been dealt. Human experience is invariably problematic, unpredictable, and the resourceful individual learns to accept and then to rise above their circumstances. Now, over time, Lincoln's anguish and his heartache softened into what Schenck calls serene resignation to his fate. It was from this place of serene resignation that he addressed the nation's trials with an amazing combination of poise, intelligence, resolve, and sensitivity. Whatever greatness Lincoln achieved cannot be explained, Schenck says, as a triumph over his personal suffering. This was not a story about transformation, but of integration. Lincoln did not do great work because he had solved the problem of his own melancholy. He never did. The problem of his melancholy was all the more fuel for the fires that sustained his great work. Now, raised in a culture that promises a cure for every affliction, and a culture that holds that it's wrong to allow any malady to go untreated, many of us have developed perhaps this unrealistic notion of what constitutes wellness. Wellness does not mean living in a steady state of undiminished and unblemished happiness. It does not imply a state of that is untainted by sadness or self-doubt or distress. Thomas More, the great Jungian analyst, says that the Christian doctrine of original sin and the Buddhist doctrine of the Four Noble Truths teach that human life is wounded to its essence. We are wounded, he says, simply by being the children of Adam and Eve, metaphorically speaking. We enter life differently. We enter life perhaps more productively, he observes, when we accept that we are wounded and don't feel all the time this overwhelming urgency to find an antidote to everything that ails us. So rather than freedom from our woundedness and illusory ambition, he tells us, our ultimate objective should be human wholeness. And that means leaving room in our psyche for those darker elements that contribute to a truly balanced perspective. Now, in his book, Let Your Life Speak, Parker Palmer describes how he himself managed to somehow sabotage his own personal and professional life by ignoring all the painful sensations that were welling up and that were clamoring for attention beneath his self-inflating ego. And ultimately, all those sensations could not be denied. And Parker Palmer spun out of control. He descended into a deep depression. Today, he says, I attend to my own truth, and now I feel at home in my skin for the very first time. Now, Lincoln's introspectiveness did not cause him to obsess over his emotions to the point that he lost all interest in external affairs, in the affairs of his country, the affairs of the world. Periods of solitude and withdrawal were always preceded, and then they were followed by determined professional and political engagement. At one particularly difficult time in his life, Lincoln admitted that death held no terrors for him, that he could quite easily kill himself. But what stopped him, he said, was this irrepressible desire to accomplish something while I live, something that would redound to the interest of my fellow man. And so this then was the third clue to Lincoln's ability to deal successfully with persistent and deep-seated emotional issues. Because above all else, he was a man who was committed to the common good, a man who believed that he did have something to contribute, a man who found in service to others an antidote to his despair. The age-old prescription for melancholy is to try to set the mind on a concrete project, something outside of oneself, Joshua Schenck writes. Otherwise, all those morbid and hopeless thoughts take on a life of their own and create a sense of frenetic powerlessness. That's an assessment that is shared by a woman named Elizabeth Berg, who thinks that doctors and therapists today should prescribe more service projects. Positive emotional energy is released by the work that we do on behalf of others, when the mindful investigation of our inner life is accompanied by compassionate engagement in the life of the greater community. Now, Lincoln's commitment was to his fellow human beings, to his country. But in this era of climate change and species depletion, we can choose instead to mend the fabric of our natural world. There is a synergistic interplay between planetary and personal well-being, Theodore Roszak writes, and as we work to heal Gaia, Gaia's healing powers begin flowing into us. Abraham Lincoln knew something about this, even though he was not particularly a naturalist. He spent his formative years laboring on his family farm. Hard work that he did not particularly relish, but the experience did sensitize him to nature and to the suffering of other sentient beings. He was much more empathetic than many young men of his era. He once declared to his stepsister, somewhat embarrassedly, that an ant's life is to it as sweet as our lives are to us. Did Lincoln believe in nature's therapeutic value? It's hard to say, but it is an idea that has achieved significant currency in our own era. Now, some therapists believe that whatever emotional problems a person may have, those problems are likely to be aggravated by what we call nature deficit disorder. Linda Wheelwright-Schmidt, another Jungian analyst, reminds us that the urban environments in which most of us live today are of very recent provenance. For 99% of the time that human beings have inhabited this planet, the natural world was our primary source of both physical and emotional healing and sustenance. Traditional healers are much more attuned to this reality than our allopathic healers are. Leslie Gray is a Native American therapist. She has a degree in psychology from Harvard University, but she also studied under a Cherokee shaman. And this shaman convinced her that emotional healing can be powerfully enabled if we can find a place in our lives, a place in our environment that will give us a feeling of being whole. The Native American poet Joy Harjo underscores that particular point with these lovely lines. She writes, "Eagle, that Sunday morning over Salt River, circling in blue sky in wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. Breathe in, knowing we are made of all this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born and die soon within a true circle of motion, like eagle, rounding out the morning inside of us." Communion with nature should, however, be complemented by companionship with individuals who will allow the slow, halting, idiosyncratic process of emotional healing to unfold naturally. Now, while he was in the throes of his deep depression, Parker Palmer recalls how many well-meaning people came to his house and tried to fix him. But what he says I really needed was someone or some people who would stand patiently at the edge of my mystery and my misery and just be with me. Most people, Parker Palmer observes, are rather uncomfortable in the presence of suffering. And so they deal with their own uneasiness by glibly proposing solutions in an effort to distract the sufferer and change the tone of the conversation. But that strategy inhibits the ability of both parties to deal honestly and openly with discomforting emotional issues. Lincoln was fortunate because emotional illness had not acquired the degree of stigma that it has more recently. On the contrary, pervasive sadness, melancholy were thought in the 1840s and 50s to signify depth of character and hard-won wisdom. And so Lincoln's friends empathized with him and were not nearly so quick to offer advice or to try to alter or dispel his dark moods. So they had free play in his imagination. Thomas More used a similar approach with a disillusioned and depressed 70-year-old Catholic priest. Rather than presenting possible remedies to this priest, More simply brought, as he put it, an attitude of acceptance and interest to Bill's condition. He says, I tried to appreciate the way his soul was expressing itself. And so at each session, Bill's condition and his mood slowly lifted. And then going back to his parish, he began using the same technique with his parishioners, saying, I will never again tell another person how to live. I will only talk to them about their mystery. To become ourselves, our true and our whole selves, that which, as Parker Palmer puts it, we are created to be. That's what this journey toward emotional sustenance, emotional sustainability, that's what it's all about. This is the final goal, the final gift of the hard, prolonged process of emotional healing. But here it is important to remember that the self that embarks on this journey initially is not going to be the same self that emerges as that process unfolds. The experience of suffering invariably reshapes and refines us. We can never recover that cherished childhood self, that naive self, because that will have long ago been forfeited. The innocence will have been lost. The scars will be there that can no longer be removed. And perfect health is really not the point. We seek rather to be at peace as a more integrated, emotionally educated, and confident self, so that, like Abraham Lincoln, we can move into the future with the sad, sweet hope that better days will someday come. Blessed be, and amen.